So let's talk a bit about CSR from the 1950s onwards, in the aftermath of World War II. In the 1950s, of course, there was an enormous amount of economic growth, American money flooding into Europe, and a debate about business ethics also began. Howard Bowen is also known as the father of CSR, along with Peter Drucker, and both of them were writing and talking about the responsibilities of the businessman in the 1960s. But it was really in the early 1960s that environmental awareness began to kick off. Some credit rising middle-class wealth and a love of the outdoors for raising awareness, but one of the key turning points was Rachel Carson's 1961 book, Silent Spring. Silent Spring was a book which fundamentally changed the way many people think about the environment, particularly in the United States, because it highlighted the dangers, or the perceived dangers, of DDT, a wonder chemical which had become used in a widespread way across the US, and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring predicted that if its use was not checked and regulated, it could result in all the robins, a very cute, beautiful songbird, dying, and therefore in spring there would be silence because the robins would not be singing because they'd been killed by DDT, which had affected their food chain. It's impossible to underestimate the significance of Silent Spring, at least for the environmental movement, and it really stands the test of time as a key moment in modern environmentalism. Also in the 1960s, Ralph Nader, latterly famous for being accused of causing Al Gore to lose the 2000 election to George Bush, Ralph Nader was a serious social activist in the 1960s, and he published a seminal book called Unsafe at Any Speed in the 1960s, 1965, and he exposed the cost-benefit analyses used by automakers to decide if they were going to do recalls of cars, some of which they knew would kill the drivers. And when this book came out, it realised that society realised that the automakers had been putting a price on people's lives, and this was a major corporate scandal of the mid-1960s. Of course, we saw a rise in concern about globalisation and the use of chemical weapons with regard to napalm in the 1960s, and various US chemical companies, Dow, DuPont, and other large companies were demonised in some sections of the media for contributing towards death and destruction in countries like Vietnam and Laos. And of course, in the early 1970s, there was a lot of political, economic turmoil, social unrest, and Earth Day 1970 represented a major turning point also in environmentalism. Time magazine put Barry Commoner, a leading environmentalist, on its front cover, and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which had come out a couple of years earlier, had raised a huge amount of debate around whether or not humanity could survive without billions of people dying from starvation as populations grew, but agricultural yields so far had not. Unfortunately, Mr. Ehrlich is latterly known to have been quite wrong in his predictions, because the Green Revolution of the 1970s in agriculture saved humankind from the mass starvation which he had predicted. But the Limits to Growth report, produced by the Club of Rome in 1972, was another key moment where we started to think as a society in perhaps Western Europe, in the US at least, about whether or not there really were limits to economic growth versus the environment and versus population, and what that could mean for the future. Moving forward to the 1980s, there were some key moments for the CSR, sustainability, business ethics community there too. Not least the tragedy in Bhopal in 1984, where a gas explosion at a Union Carbide plant killed somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 people. The numbers are, of course, unfortunately disputed, given the length of time in which some of the effects took place and the difficulty of keeping track. However, this terrible explosion, for which Dow Chemical is still partly blamed given their 1989 acquisition of Union Carbide, despite having settled with the Indian government, this incident really led to the creation of one of the first modern B2B CSR collaborations in some ways. So the Responsible Care Initiative, which was created as a result of Bhopal, is cited as one of the first examples of where an industry got together to create voluntary standards which they would adhere to around safety in shipping and operation around chemicals. So responsible care seen as a positive outcome, one of the few, or one of the only, from the tragedy of Bhopal. Of course, other key moments in the 1980s included the Brundtland Commission, fronted by Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, and the Brundtland Commission came up in 1987 with that famous definition of sustainable development: do not remove the opportunity for those tomorrow by using up resources today. And that's a very, very famous definition which is still used for sustainable development. A much wider term than sustainable business, but of course sustainable business is all about contributing to sustainable development. And then the Exxon Valdez disaster of 1989 further raised environmental awareness across Europe and across the US when we saw pristine wilderness in Alaska, unfortunately tragically polluted by a terrible spillage of oil. And the lawsuits for that were only settled a couple of years ago, and the environment is still to recover. So 89 Exxon Valdez, really a key moment. And then a couple of years later, the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where presidents, prime ministers, actors and celebrities got together to raise global environmental awareness, was also another seminal moment. And in fact, the 20-year anniversary of that took place last year, again in Rio, where they produced a document entitled The Future We Want. But unfortunately, as we now know, many less presidents and prime ministers turned up 20 years later, as did in 1992. Other key moments of the 1990s, well, Shell had a pretty tough time. They suffered the Brent Spar oil storage rig humiliation, where Greenpeace persuaded them, in inverted commas, not to dispose of it in the sea, which Shell said was the most environmentally scientific thing to do in terms of sustainability. And the campaign against Brent Spar really led to Shell's name being muddied, certainly in Europe and in the US. But also in that same period, 1995-96, Shell's involvement in Nigeria became very controversial when the dictator Sani Abacha executed the activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was reputed to have been causing Shell and other oil companies a lot of trouble in the Ogoni region, the Ogoniland region of Nigeria. Shell was partly blamed for his death, certainly accused of collusion with the dictator Sani Abacha, and for a number of years afterwards, Shell struggled to hire top-notch research chemists. And it really was a seminal moment for the oil industry and for Shell itself as they reviewed and thought about their ethics policies. Other key moments of the 1990s, well, there were many and we can't pretend to cover all of them here, but a couple of others would include the Body Shop and their rise in the late 80s and their prominence in the 90s, whereby Anita Roddick, in particular the founder of the Body Shop, really championed environmental awareness and awareness of the rights of Indigenous people. And the Body Shop was a major brand, and it was one of the first mainstreamings, you might call it, of a global environmental brand around a business. And of course, also in the 1990s, we saw those sweatshop shocks where companies such as Gap and Nike initially had not responded terribly well to accusations of sweatshop labour. Social and sort of ethical audits were perhaps starting to take place then, but that didn't stop the activists from punishing the companies with boycotts and campaigns against them. And we now see companies like Nike and Shell, almost 20 years later, becoming real leaders in sustainability and sustainable thinking in the supply chain. Back then they were icons of globalization, icons of sweatshop exploitation, and you of course can argue whether or not that is fair, given the economic opportunities that they offered workers. Still, those moments, those scandals, those boycotts were very important in the development of the modern corporate responsibility movement. And finally, moving forward to the noughties, a very quick tour of that decade includes a look at the pharmaceutical industry. Certainly in the late 1990s and early noughties, the pharmaceutical industry was extremely controversial due to their scandals related to intellectual property, the use of patents, the use of their drugs and the copying of their drugs by emerging market governments who claimed they had a national emergency over issues such as HIV and AIDS. The pharmaceutical companies were seen to have responded very badly to this and were punished in the court of public opinion. We also in 2001 saw Enron declared bankrupt on, I believe, the 3rd of December 2001. Incidentally, the day the first edition of Ethical Corporation magazine was published, which was a slightly strange day. But of course the Enron bankruptcy led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, the creation of a giant compliance culture, the creation of a huge emphasis on ethics, on reporting, and on transparency, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, where we had our own Parmalat scandal in 2003 or so, and that of course raised awareness of the ethics of the governance in European companies alongside Enron and the other corporate scandals of Tyco, Global Crossing and so on of that period. In 2002, 2003 we saw a couple of the most successful multi-stakeholder collaborative partnerships set up. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the Kimberley process really sought to change the nature of both oil and gas revenue transparency and mining revenue transparency, but also with regard to the Kimberley process, with regard to blood diamonds and the tracking and tracing and the eradication of blood diamonds, particularly from West Africa, where they had been infamous in the late 1990s. And these multi-stakeholder processes, convened by governments, but involved with heavy involvement from extractive industry companies, are still held up as models of CSR and cross-sector and cross-country collaboration on sustainability and business ethics issues. So their creation was indeed a seminal moment. And just finally, of course, a couple of other topics. The World Summit in Sustainable Development of Sustainable Development in 2002 in South Africa launched the modern era of corporate partnerships, where we saw companies diving in to partner with any NGO they could in many cases, and particularly around sustainable development. And that 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development was indeed a seminal moment for many companies and the notion of collaborative partnerships. We also saw in the late period there, particularly the rise of China in 2003, 2006 and beyond. Of course, their double-digit growth is legendary. The Made in China label became even more known, and we saw really in that period China's growth accelerate to the point today where we see these enormous factory complexes the size of cities and the social and environmental challenges that those now present, which we're ever more aware of. And of course, just to finish off on the tour of the late noughties, I suppose the subprime crisis from 2006-07, the incident with Trafigura in 2006 in Ivory Coast, the Deepwater Horizon explosion in 2010, and of course the modern debates around tax in 2012 and in 2013, alongside Shell's drilling for oil in the Arctic and the failure of Arctic exploration, the opposition to that by environmental activists. These are all key moments in the modern debate, and these are all areas which we will be exploring throughout the course.